Good afternoon. We will reconvene. Our final session today examines accountability for college sports at the board and presidential levels. As part of its Committed to Change reform agenda, the NCAA adopted changes that will hold university presidents and chancellors, I quote, personally accountable for their athletics programs following the rules. The Association of Governing Boards also recently released a new board statement of commitment and accountability for intercollegiate athletics. This session will explore the guidance being given to strengthen oversight for intercollegiate athletics and identify specific issues and tools such as the NCAA's institutional performance program that should be prioritized as part of this new level of accountability. We're so pleased today to have Rick Ligon, President, Association of Governing Boards of Universities and Colleges, along with two NCAA leaders, Dave Schnazy, Vice President of Academic and Membership Affairs, and Troy Arthur, the Director of Academic and Membership Affairs. Rick, we'll start with you and then turn it over to Dave and Troy. Thank you so much for coming in, gentlemen.
Thank you. Good morning. Chair Cartwright and Chair Duncan and colleagues who are members of the commission. I really want to thank the commission for inviting me to come and provide an overview of AGB's most recent statement on board engagement in intercollegiate athletics. Many of you know, AGB and the Knight Commission have had a long and constructive history stretching back to the beginning of the commission when Father Hesburgh and Bill Friday were first co-chairs of this important body. In the Commission's 2001 report entitled A Call to Action, in fact, the Commission stated that national higher ed associations, such as the Association of Governing Boards in particular, can and should do more to help resolve the persistent problems addressed in the report itself, meaning that boards were an important player, both in terms of the issues and the responses to those challenges around college athletics. AGB heard, supported, and responded to that call, and among other things, we, in 2012, issued a report that we were invited to do by this commission, and among its recommendations, we declared, or the panel that put this together, and John Castine, the President Emeritus, University of Virginia, chaired that body for us, but the report stated that higher education governance doesn't stop at the water's edge of intercollegiate athletics. In fact, boards can't remain on the sidelines when it comes to the issues confronting our institutions and college sports, and yet often they have. Boards must be more aware and appropriately engaged in this particular area of institutional business and policy, and they can't be passive. The stakes are simply too high. The statement, AGB's statement on intercollegiate athletics that our board of directors recently approved is actually the third AGB statement on this subject, and it's probably the most emphatic in terms of basically informing boards as to what they really need to do in this space. Our first such report was released back in 2004, and we remain committed to advancing the appropriate and effective best practices for boards in intercollegiate sports. A few background points on the work of AGB and board governance that might be interesting. This country's model of higher education governance actually dates back to the colonial period. We're in this governance business for over 350 years. The model depends on independent governing bodies, and that's an important term. And it's been affirmed, that model, by judicial decisions and accreditors over many years. It's a structure that's evolved and matured over those 300 years to address emerging social challenges, changes in higher education structure, institutional priorities, and public expectation. Today, some 50,000 men and women serve on the boards of some 3,000 or so higher ed governing boards, public and private higher ed. They hold fiduciary authority and the ultimate responsibilities, and are being called upon to address some of the most challenging issues confronting our sector, including the very real fact that higher ed's standing with the public itself is in jeopardy. For almost 100 years of that total 300 plus, AGB's mission has been to preserve and strengthen this country's unique model of citizen governance of higher ed, to educate board members about their fundamental responsibilities and best practices as they are elevated to meet their own serious look at board accountability. Central to boards' basic responsibilities, governing boards are accountable to their students and to the public. And so throughout our history at AGB, we've worked with boards and institutional leaders to help boards understand their appropriate responsibility in key areas such as student success, academic quality, the business model of their institutions, enrollment, affordability, institution accreditation, cultural issues such as campus inclusion, and most recently freedom of speech and student safety, and intercollegiate athletics. The three recommendations in this most recent AGB statement on athletics reinforce the fact that engagement and responsibility for athletics is part of the work of a governing board. First, boards are ultimately accountable for athletics policy and oversight. Boards need to ensure the integrity of athletics programs. And third, boards need to give sufficient time and attention to this aspect of the responsibilities. Now, let me be clear. Our recommendations aren't about board micromanagement. Boards delegate administrative authority to institution leadership, but rather it's about recognizing the board's appropriate scope of its authority and recommendation and engagement. Boards need to balance the sense of a predictive standard of its governance with flexibility based on their own judgment, the context of their institution and the situation that they're facing, and particular circumstance. There are many benefits, as you all know, to both students and institutions that flow from intercollegiate athletics, but there are challenges that this commission has long been concerned with and actually very proactive on, including costs and finance of college sports, academic performance of student athletes, health and safety risks, and we've only need to look at the headlines to find some high-profile athletic scandals and ethical violations. These are among the factors that lead to the perception by many in our ever-widening gulf between athletics and academic cultures, both inside and outside of our institutions. College and university boards have a fiduciary obligation to ensure that athletics programs advance their institution education mission and strategic plan and meet appropriate standards of ethical behavior. Governing boards need to recognize that accountability for athletic programs address program finance, student-athlete success and safety, strategic planning, policies related to Title IX and conference play, and other areas of policy. The breadth of board responsibility is clear and compelling. And given its impact on institutional culture, college sports is integral to fulfilling an institution's mission and educational purpose. The public is watching, and failures in this area are adding to the erosion of trust in higher education. College sports is not an optional responsibility for a governing board. It's part of the job, and boards must be aware. You all have received, I think, copies of our recent statement, so let me just focus on 3 points and allow my colleagues to share their thoughts. Point 1, boards have no option. They need to engage. Board governance isn't about a menu of choices to address some priorities, some issues, and ignore others. Too often we've seen board passivity when it comes to athletics issues or a lack of full transparency between boards and institutional leadership, and have not always given these issues appropriate attention on board and committee agendas. Boards really have no option, and our statement makes it clear that college sports should be on the menu of the fiduciary body and its members, boards. Presidents must be fully transparent with their governing body on athletics, both policies and challenges, in the same way they are with addressing other policy issues confronting their institution. Now, I personally have served on 3 higher education governing boards, publics and privates, and I know that the work is hard. It requires time, study, and it comes with homework. And if done well, it will be clear that board members, some of whom may be significant donors to an institution's athletics program, must be fiduciaries first and fans second. Second point, Boards and presidents need to work together on athletics, and this is a key point. In another recent AGB study or report, one that focused on what we call the 21st century institution president, we interviewed some 150 college and university presidents, surveyed them, interviewed them, and they indicated that in today's environment, presidents and boards need to, quote, re-examine and, if necessary, change the president and board's fundamental assumptions about their working relationship. Now, while the scope of that report goes well beyond intercollegiate athletics, its message remains relevant to AGB's new statement on board accountability for college sports. Presidents and boards need to work together. It's about leadership and collaboration. It's about trust and appropriate engagement and accountability. Again, this is not about board micromanagement. Clearly, boards need to avoid the impulse to help presidents administer their institution's athletics programs. We don't need boards asking for offices adjacent to the president and to help them do presidenting. The recruitment and selection of coaches and athletics personnel, as well as the setting of salaries, are generally out of bounds for board member engagement, except perhaps, as our report states, related to compensation decisions involving the most highly paid athletics personnel. And governing boards shouldn't be advocating for staff changes based on wins and losses. Boards need information in order to work constructively with presidents on these issues. They need dashboards and metrics to track key areas such as academic performance and the health and wellness of student athletes. And the NCAA's new IPP that my colleagues will be discussing could be an important resource for boards, and I'm hoping that the NCAA considers providing access to that data by board leaders and other members of boards. Our statement isn't just an effort to add to the authority of a board in some artificial power grab. Rather, it's a mandate of fiduciary responsibility. And to that end, the statement also offers in the back a statement of commitment and activity that models itself on a document that the ACC institutions used to have their board chair sign in public once a year. And it's a public way for boards to recognize that they own the fiduciary responsibility and accountability for college sports, and they could sign that little document. Last point, the actual responsibilities that boards must be recognized. The engagement and responsibility of boards on the issue of athletics need to be recognized and acknowledged beyond the walls of the campus. It should be recognized at the conference level and by the NCAA. I've been clear over the years that AGB supports delegation of the day-to-day leadership of athletics to institution presidents, as they do in other areas, but we do urge the NCAA to clarify its own formal policy language regarding governing boards, to clarify that governing boards are the institution fiduciary body and therefore must assume its own appropriate engagement and accountability. And AGB will also continue to urge the NCAA to include members of higher education governing boards on its own governing board and its several division governing bodies. Adding the voice of independent and experienced board members can help inform the NCAA's decision-making while sending a clear signal to governing boards that they have a heightened responsibility for this area of accountability. And lastly, again, we urge the NCAA to make their IPP data at least available to governing board chairs. So in conclusion, boards are more than just delegators of responsibility. They do hold ultimate accountability in a collaborative responsibility arrangement for their institution that they serve. It's about mission achievement, financial stability, and it's ultimately about reputation. Only the board can determine how best to meet its responsibilities, especially as it relates to athletics. So far from exempt, intercollegiate athletics programs are integral to institution missions that boards hold in trust, and therefore it requires serious board care, engagement, and accountability. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rick. Dave?
Thank you, Co-Chair Cartwright, Co-Chair Duncan, members of the commission. It's good to be here with you today. Troy and I look forward to talking to you a little bit about presidential accountability and demonstrating the institutional performance program, which many of you know presidents, ADs, and even board members find helpful as they try and exert appropriate institutional control and presidential accountability. Just out of curiosity, how many people here are familiar with the IPP? Wow, that's impressive. Most everybody. Walt, I know you are. So before we talk about that and demonstrate the tool itself, I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes talking about presidential accountability. We have regulations in this space. We have two broad constitutional provisions, one that relates to presidents making sure that they administer and are accountable for all elements of an athletics program, and then also a broad provision that relates to institutional control and rules compliance. But beyond those two constitutional provisions, we have a bylaw, and bylaw 19, for those keeping score at home. It's a bylaw that says presidents and chancellors have to certify rules compliance before they enter a team or an individual into an NCAA championship. So that's a specific provision. Now these regulations have been on the books for many years, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, so you all have heard about these. But what you may not have heard about is that recently the presidential bodies adopted a few more accountability measures. Number one being the attestation of compliance. So chancellors and presidents in all three divisions now have to attest to certify that they are following NCAA rules and that their programs are. As an aside, it's kind of nice that now this program or this attestation requirement is going to be housed in the LMS within the NCAA. So you can see video modules that relate to institutional control, rules compliance, and I believe you can even certify that you're attesting to rules compliance within that program. So that's a nice benefit. In addition to that specific one, we have two other new ones that are specific to Division I. The first is that now contracts between presidents, chancellors, and boards have to include a stipulation that the president and the chancellor will cooperate with NCAA investigations. So that's new. And the other one is that institutions now can be held more accountable for people they hire. So if they hire somebody who is under a show cause order and that person commits an NCAA infraction within that show cause window, the institution could be held more accountable for those violations. The challenge, as you know, is that not just in reading and understanding what those provisions mean, but really it's about figuring out practically how to comply with those, right? And so the Division I board, the Division I Presidential Forum recently talked about this. They talked about what are some best practices, how can they move this agenda forward and make sure that we're doing things the right way in Division I. I don't know if it's appropriate now to turn to President Peterson, who was at that meeting. He can provide real-time feedback, or whether you want to wait until the discussion period to ask him, but I know he has some comments on that point.
Well, why don't we wait?
Want to wait? Okay.
Okay, great. So we're going to turn it over, or I'm going to turn it over to Troy. He's going to demonstrate the program. He's going to comment on how the program might help boards, chancellors, presidents exert appropriate institutional control. We can talk about questions you have, and we could even get into the question that Rick raised about providing access to boards or at least board chairs.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Chair Cartwright, Chair Duncan, thank you for this opportunity. Members of the commission, thank you. I really appreciate the time to be here today. I want to do three things. The first is I want to talk a little bit about the context behind the IPP data management system. Then I want to talk about benefits. And then lastly, I want to talk about how this program can align itself with some of the recommendations coming out of AGB. So the first is just from a basic context. We want to make sure everyone understands that the reason this system, the why, in terms of why this system was developed, was really to help campus leaders, conference leaders with their decision-making on campus. We wanted to create an opportunity for people to have data to drive decision-making and to assist the decision-making on campus. And so the reason why that was important, as many of you know, higher education, intercollegiate athletics, there's a significant number of complexities that every institution has to deal with. So we wanted to create a system, a process that can create some efficiencies and make it easier for campus leaders to drive decision-making. This program was developed with a number of people's opinions, thoughts, comments. We talked to hundreds of athletic directors, commissioners, presidents, chancellors. We even reached out to the Knight Commission, and they were really, really helpful with some of the visualization of the program. So thank you for all the support and the guidance that you provided to us in that regard. If we can go to the next slide. So as we look at the system, a couple of things to note. One is that the system is a data management system. So essentially, all the data in the system is provided by our member institutions. This started in 2011 by the Board of Directors in Division I approving this process. So all the information in the system in Division I is required data that institutions provide to the NCAA. That data then is consolidated, reviewed by our research department internally, and then pushed back out to our member institutions. Recently, Division II and Division III has adopted this system. We also have developed a system for our conference offices, so they have the ability to see how their members are performing on some key indicators. When you look at the system, there's a couple of things. Again, as I mentioned, it's to assist our institutional leaders with their decision making, but we also want to talk about some of the areas that we have the data. There are over 100 data models or so unique fields that you can collect information and understand how your institution is performing. Each of those different data models can be divided by sport, gender, ethnicity. So there's an array of different ways the data can be used. We started this year for the first time collecting information on health and safety. This is the first program of its kind in the NCAA that we're collecting information about health and safety, evaluation of programs, not individuals, but programs, to see how they're functioning. Next slide. So, as I mentioned before, the system doesn't require a whole lot of work from our member institutions. Annually, they're submitting data to the NCAA. That data is secured, is password protected. Institutional presidents and chancellors at every institution makes the determination of who gets to see that data. So that's not an NCAA decision, that's the decision that's made for each institution at a local level. Next slide. So a little bit of information about usership of the data. We know right now that we have, and this information that you have is a little bit dated. This information came from about 2 years ago. We launched the system 3 years ago, so we wanted to see what type of usership we were getting. So as you can see in the data that's on the screen, we had about 60% of our members using the data. We know now in terms of registrations, in terms of people logging in and putting their IDs, and we have over 90% of Division I who's using the system, and Division II has a high percentage that's using the system as well. Division III, different than Divisions I and II, the information that's submitted in the data system is not required in Division III. So the usership in Division III is probably the least out of the 3 divisions. Next slide. So how is this data being used? It's being used in a number of different ways. One, as I said, in terms of visibility and what we like to call reporting. So as we work with institutions and conferences, one of the things we've seen is that presidents and chancellors are providing this information to faculty senates, giving them information about how an institution is performing in a number of different indicators. We're seeing that information also shared with governing boards, institutions through their president and their athletic leadership is deciding what slides they think are most important to their institutions. So we are starting to see how this data is being used from that perspective. It's also being used for planning and strategic planning for our athletic department. The data is used from a standpoint of being able to take information, looking at aspirational peer groups. So you can look at how you're performing as it relates to your conference. You can look at how you're performing as it relates to your subdivision. You also can look at it as it relates to how you're performing in terms of aspirational peer group. So an institution can decide what institution in divisions 1, 2, and 3 that they want to aspire or how they want to compare themselves. The interesting thing is you can't do one-on-one comparisons because we want to protect the information from each of our institutions. So what we do is you have to put in an aggregate, if you will, of 8 institutions. So then for those 8 institutions, you'll get the median information for those institutions. Next slide. So how does this align with the statement that you heard from Rick, and as we talk about the principles that AGB just aligned? So what I want to do now is just give you some examples of how an institution may want to provide information to a governing board in terms of how this data can be utilized for institutions. So the first principle, and Rick talked a lot about fiduciary responsibility. So one of the things that's important that we believe in the system, as you all know, data can only tell you part of the story. So what we've tried to do is obviously give you the quantitative piece, but as you all know, there's also a qualitative piece that we ask our institutions to ask additional questions, look for other resources so that they can paint a better picture of what's going on at that particular institution. So next slide. So, and I know this is hard to read, and I don't expect anybody to be able to read this, but this is just an example of all the financial data. And believe it or not, the data that you see in every line is a drop-down where you can click, and it takes you to one of our data model screens. And this is not all of the financial data that we collect for our member institutions. So as you can imagine, and the reason I want to show you this, there's a lot of data that we have, a lot of data. So as it relates to fiduciary responsibilities of a governing board, some questions that can be asked. How are we doing as it relates to our revenue and expenses? Our debt indicators, self-sufficiency, athletic endowments, transfers of funds throughout the institution. One thing that we've heard a lot of recent years is student fees. So all these things in terms of looking at the health of the athletic department are questions that governing boards may be interested in. Next slide. So this is an example of what one of our data models look like in the system. So as you see, we have a fictitious institution, ABC University. You see that's the black line going across the top. You see there's a field for all divisions, so that's the purple line at the bottom. And then you see the line in the middle for no football. So what we consider that to be is the subdivision of this particular institution. So as you can see, one of the questions that a governing board or a trustee may want to know is this institution's financial model sustainable? Now that's an institutional question. That's not a question that the NCAA or a conference can answer, but that's a decision that an institution makes based on its mission and its purpose. Next slide. So principle number 2, talking about the institutional integrity, especially as it relates to the educational mission of the university. Next slide. So the question is, are we moving young people to graduation? And so some questions that the system can help answer, are we recruiting the right student athletes? As I mentioned earlier, this data is being pulled from our eligibility center, so we know the profiles of all the student athletes, prospective student athletes that are coming to an institution. So we have the ability to look at that and see who are we recruiting, what's their academic profile, and how are they progressing through that process. The other question is the outcome data. Many of you are familiar with the APR. We have the multi-year APR in this information that allows us to see how the institution is performing in that indice. The other thing that we look at is obviously, is the student athlete progressing towards a degree? So all the outcome data in terms of retention and other items are questions that can be asked by not only governing board, but other leaders on campus. Another question here is, You can see the comparison looking at federal graduation rates. With the federal graduation rates, how are our student athletes performing against the student body population? And are they graduating at a higher rate? So again, this is all questions that obviously governing boards and other leaders on campus may want to know as they're going through the information. Next slide. Another important piece is demographics. We talked about, and I heard earlier, we talked about gender equity, inclusion. So how's the institution performing in those indices? So the ability to look at the student athlete population, look at your coaching population, be able to see what is the demographics of our institution, and does that demographic align with the mission and the purpose and the goals of the university? And to have sight lines on that information is really helpful and important. Last piece in terms of this area is health and safety. As I mentioned, we are now just collecting health and safety data. So we have data models now in the system that can speak to how are we performing, how many athletic trainers do we have for our student athletes. And so again, the program is not looking at injury surveillance, it's really looking at program performance. How is the institution performing in a number of different key questions. So systematic approaches. Next slide. So the system, and I mentioned this earlier, you have the ability to assess and develop your own peer groups that you would like to develop. So in this situation, again, we're looking at ABC institution, that's the black line. The comparison and the lines that you see is all of Division I, the subdivision, the conference, and you have the ability, if this is a public institution, you can say, I want to look at all publics. You can say, I want to look at all publics in my state. I want to look at privates on the Northeast. So there's a number of utilization that we have in the system depending on what you're trying to get at and what information you're looking for. The other thing is, and this is something that was important to our presidents and chancellors, was, okay, Troy, we have a ton of data in the system. We don't have the time to look at all this data. So this feature here answers one question that we hear all the time. Where is my institution an outlier? So you can go into the system, pull areas where you can say, where are we at the bottom of our conference? Where are we at the bottom of our subdivision? And it will pull all the different data models that the institution is at the bottom, if you will, of a respective group that you're reviewing. So, or Dave reminded me, or top, not always at the bottom. So you can look at that and really just drill down on that information if that's something that's important. So how else could this be used? Again, time saving. A lot of this information is information that, as I mentioned earlier, institutions have at their fingertips. They have the ability to really reduce. In the past, as we talk to other institutions, we've heard that getting their hands on this type of information for reporting purposes took a lot of time. Now this information can be pulled, developed, and reported out in a matter of minutes. The system is responsive, so you can access the system from your cell phones, tablets, so it has a lot of utility to be able to help people in answering questions that they have on campus. Next slide. So the last thing that I want to talk about, and then I'll close my comments, is we've seen a lot of good work done, and we have a very small staff that helps our institutions. One thing we're trying to do is to build, if you will, power users amongst our conferences and our institutions, to find people who are not only interested in this, but helping us to understand more of the needs of campus, looking for ways in which we can develop better tools and better processes to help institutions understand what changes and modifications that it wants to make for its member institutions. So with that, I will close my comments and thank you for the opportunity.
And so just real quick, because Troy mentioned power users, I just want to note that Sandy Hatfield Club back there is, she meets the definition of a power user. If you look in the dictionary and look up power user, her face will be in that.
Thank you so much. Let's open it up. Bud, you want to start?
Yeah, so I thought it'd be helpful to get the background on the IPP. If you start talking about presidents and chancellors, and I'll use those terms interchangeably, but I mean the person that's responsible on the campus, not a system head. But if you're going to hold presidents and chancellors responsible, and they are going to be responsible, and having some way to measure how you're doing is enormously helpful. I mean, this is a great tool, and particularly the last part that Troy mentioned, where you can go in and see where are we doing well and where are we not doing so well. And so I thought it'd be helpful for that. But last week in Orlando, the governing board met, and at the presidential forum, there were 4 key items that I wanted to mention. The first was that at the forum was reaffirmed the critical role of presidents, chancellors, the critical role that presidents and chancellors play in establishing a culture of integrity and compliance on the campus. So that was the first key point. Affirmed support for the president or chancellor attestation as to the board principles of institutional control and rules compliance, and acknowledge that more work is needed in terms of the specifics of that. So exactly what are the presidents or chancellors attesting to? There are some documents now that deal with governing boards, but those require some clarification. Noted important distinctions between the responsibilities of the president and chancellor and the director of athletics, and I thought it was interesting when you saw the D1, 60% of presidents or chancellors had been on the tool, 60% of FARs, but I didn't catch what it was for ADs. Do you remember, Dave?
60. It was 60.
60, yeah, I was thinking it was 60 all across the board, but that surprised me a little bit. Not the 60% of the presidents, but 60% of the athletic directors. Only 60% of the D1 athletic directors had looked at it. So noted this distinction again between responsibilities of presidents and the director of athletics, and trying to identify appropriate control systems, and finally reaffirmed that for presidents or chancellors, their campus boards hold them accountable for the athletics program. And I think this is something that Rick alluded to, that institutional penalties for violations will impact the president or chancellor. I think that's clear, and thus individual penalties for presidents and chancellors may not be necessary. So the idea is that the boards should and do hold presidents and chancellors responsible for the performance or behavior or climate within intercollegiate athletics, and that as a result of that, the sense was that it is probably not necessary for there to be a specific penalty structure that addressed to presidents or chancellors of institutions. If you've got an institution that has problems in athletics, the board is probably going to take some action to address those problems in one form or another, and that will inevitably impact the president or chancellor of the institution. So those were kind of the 4 key things that came out. But this IPP is going to be very helpful in helping institutions understand how are they doing in comparison with their peers, because before it was really hard to get information. Rick and Troy, you may want to help, but you made a comment that this information should be available to the boards. And I think the presidents have the ability to, on an institution by institution basis, the individual presidents have the ability or the authority to allow their boards to have access to the information about their institution. So maybe I'll stop there.
Questions, comments? Or go Paul, then Nancy, you're good.
This is very helpful. Is that on?
Yeah.
I sort of have 2 questions. The first one relates to what I would call equality of opportunity. To me, it's somewhat striking that the statement of principles only focuses on gender equity and Title IX. I would have thought that in the current environment, it would be very helpful to board members to also address in the statement of principles, ensure that the board focuses on racial and ethnic diversity. Most board members find this to be a troublesome area because they are usually on other boards, business boards and boards of other nonprofits. And they're focusing on diversity and inclusion, which has become a priority, across the business community. So I would suggest that you consider what would be the appropriate way to focus on racial and ethnic equality of opportunity. I noticed in the IPP statement under the heading of leadership, it does go beyond gender equity and deals with race and ethnicity. I think it would be useful to incorporate that into the statement of principles as well, especially in the current environment. The second comment I would make, and I'd be interested in your reactions, is that this statement of principles, to me, is describes a somewhat passive role for board members and for the Board Committee on Athletics. I read Louis Freeh's report on the Penn State issues several years ago, and it placed an incredibly proactive responsibility on board members, which I don't see reflected in here, and I would be interested in knowing whether you discuss passive versus active roles, and in what context. To me, what I found is that to say that the board committee is going to ensure that the AD does X, Y, or Z, what the board committee needs is guidance as to how to do that. Not just to say that it's going to be done, but how to do that. In my experience, one of the most valuable things we've done with the Board Committee on Athletics is to meet with the head coaches. You can find out more from a head coach meeting than you can find out reviewing reams of data and listening to everybody else in the system. Because the head coaches know the kids, they know what, and I'm not trying to be pejorative, they know the student athletes, they know what's bothering the student athletes, they know how they're trying to deal with it, they know where the resources are short and don't enable them to deal with it. So I think a more proactive model, to me, would be something worth considering.
Thank you for those comments. I think you're right. We probably could have added those 2 points that you raised in terms of race and ethnicity. They're intended to be implicit, but we could have been clearer. In terms of a degree of passivity or not, certainly in the instance that you're talking about Penn State, and you can point to others where athletics have captured headlines and been high profile, so often what we're dealing with are problems in the boardroom. They redound to whether or not the board was meeting its role as a fiduciary in an appropriate way. And I read the Freeh report as well, and your point is well taken. One of the things that we've learned, and I've been doing this governance stuff for 35 years now, and one of the things that you could say is that when you've seen one board, you've seen one board. And they are made up of men and women, 99.9% of whom, publics and privates, they want to do well. People who accept appointment from the governor or get elected or appointed by colleagues from the board itself, they are largely there to get it right. Now, we have had a long history of debate, and I think a lot of it is artificial to your point about what's policy, what's administrative, when do the boards really assert their fiduciary authority, and in what way? When do they really drill down on the performance of the AD or the coach, or as Bud says, in holding presidents accountable? And it really is a balancing act. And I think that this statement itself is as important as a reminder. Boards are going to get involved. The genie is out of the bottle in terms of board engagement across a lot of areas of institutional challenges. Higher education, intercollegiate athletics is high profile. It comes with risks. When you talk about Penn State and we talk about some other matters that we all know, ultimately it falls out in terms of what becomes the long-standing hit on an institution's reputation. Boards need to be more than passive or marginalized when it comes to that. We just came out with another piece of work called The Anatomy of Effective Governing Boards. And one of the things that historically we haven't done well, and it goes a little bit, but to the way you described to the meeting you were at, and that is to encourage boards to decide what to decide. Through our history, for the most part, boards they absorb the incoming. The agendas come from institutional leaders. The reports to committees, whether it's an athletics committee, only 6% of institutions, by the way, have freestanding athletics committees. And we personally think that's just fine. But for the most part, agendas are shaped, reports are given, and boards have been, especially on this issue, too often marginalized. And they need to be engaged, and I think they will be engaged. So I think this report actually puts boards moving towards where they need to be. Not every board needs to be responding off of the high-profile issue of the Penn States of the world. But I hope that this report captures the attention of institutional leaders, of the NCAA, of the Knight Commission, but most fundamentally to boards and board leaders about what they need to do in determining what their agenda is going to be.
Thank you. Just one comment. It might be helpful in trying to get boards to be more engaged on these issues to compare the role of the Intercollegiate Athletics Board Committee with the Audit Committee. Audit committees tend to be very proactive.
Sure.
And I think the relationship of those two committees to each other is really important. Sometimes they don't know what the relationship is and issues fall between the cracks.
You know, especially, it's an excellent point because especially, although I'd like it a little different way, but especially since the audit committees are usually where issues of risk land. And if intercollegiate athletics remains a high-profile risk, which it is in many places, that comparison makes sense. If I could just respond to something Bud said a moment ago, Bud, and I totally agree with where the accountability for presidential or chancellor performance ultimately lands. Boards are going to hold, hopefully, their presidents to account on all of these issues as well as others as well. But I must take exception over saying that I think use the words whether presidents will allow board members or leaders to see this data. I truly think that as fiduciaries who have the kind of accountability that, Paul, you were just suggesting, I think the board should determine whether and how it should have access to some of this data. So a friendly amendment.
Don't disagree at all, Rick. I guess what I was trying to convey is that the presidents have the authority to grant permission to the board members. But the NCAA gives the presidents. So I thought you were suggesting that the NCAA should make this information available to the boards.
No.
Okay.
No. I think that the institution leadership should ensure that board leaders see this information.
Let's go Nancy Walt.
Well, this is a pretty good discussion about board governance, and I wanted to switch a little bit to the IPP. It's very helpful, the way you described it, and it allowed us to get more in the weeds. I was a big champion of the external certification program and sort of hated to see it go, but I think this dashboard is incredibly helpful. I also think that there is a tendency of the athletics enterprise to organize its work around data separate from the larger landscape of a university. And you know now every university is coping with the opportunities of big data. So I would only add to the route forward that we look at these data, yes, as accountability, but also as improvement. And the way you get improvement is to share data and to figure out how to move the dial if you've got a low score on something that's really important to you. And I think set aside the pressures of accountability, getting the member institutions of the NCAA to see this as getting better And to do that, you have to be proactive and actually create opportunities for networks to develop that take a little bit of the, am I the best or am I the outlier, into, hey, we're all about trying to make the conditions better. That's improvement. And I just think that's a great place for us to go, because I think that's where universities are trying to go with things like graduation rates or matriculation or eradication of remedial and developmental ed. It's about getting better. And to do that, you have to share data. You have to share yourself. You have to be a little bit more vulnerable, which is not our want in this field. So I think that's a huge, huge opportunity, and might be a friendly opportunity for NCAA divisions and for presidents and for boards to see the world a little bit differently. We can get better at this, and I would just want to champion that. The other thing, Rick, I did tell the Commission that your Leadership Institute at AGB puts prospective presidents in training to have better board relationships, but also around athletics, so that we're growing a crop of presidents and board leaders who see it as a common course to have athletics at the
And we
center.
thank you for your leadership in that program.
Thanks. Well,
Yes, can I follow up on Nancy's concern about the IPP? So I'm very concerned that only 60% of presidents and athletic directors are looking at it. Have you analyzed the data to know which kinds of institutions are looking at it and which kinds aren't? It's not a very effective tool if just more than half of the people are looking at it.
And I apologize, when I was making my comments, I don't know if everyone heard me, that the data that we collected was from the first year after we launched the system. So we have reason to believe, we have not gone back to see today what the usage rates are, but we have reason to believe, based on registrations, that it's upwards of over 90% in Division I.
And Troy, isn't it true that that 60% figure reflects those who have gone into the system? It doesn't reflect, for example, a senior associate AD sharing the IPP data with the AD, right? So they could be getting the information, they may not be logging into it.
I see. Yeah, well, it would just, I encourage you to continue to try to make sure the data's only good if somebody's looking at it, and especially presidents. I mean, to Bud's point, if boards certainly have a fiduciary responsibility, but presidents certainly have a responsibility, especially, well, in all three divisions, to know where their institution is succeeding and where it needs to improve.
One of the things we are doing to try to make sure that presidents are getting their hands on this information is that we're able to work with our membership database. So when there is new presidents that start at an institution, we are reaching out and sending them a letter, making sure that they're aware that this information is available to them, and trying to continue that dialogue so that they have access to the information. So that's something that we're currently doing, we will continue to do.
Yeah, I would say, just as a matter of, I'm not being critical, I think the tool is really great, and so but it's only good if people are looking.
That's a good point.
Yes.
Quick final question, Rick, for you, just to try and pull together a couple threads. This morning, earlier, we talked about training and certification. I'm all for that, but I pay more attention to incentives. And Tom McMillan was here. He may be gone, a friend of mine who's done some research I hadn't seen before that looked at the actual incentive contracts for coaches and found that like 95% of the incentives were around wins and losses. So we can train, we can talk about health and safety, we can talk about academic progress, but if we're incenting wins and losses, that's what coaches are going to focus on. So just a theoretical question, is it within the board's purview to cap incentives for coaches and say institutionally, just throw out a number, no more than half of the incentives should be based upon W's and L's, and the rest should be based upon academic achievement or student athlete health and safety and well-being? Is that micromanagement, or is that good board leadership?
You know, we don't want governing boards, Arnie, to negotiate every single contract that's being cut. I think
I'm not suggesting that.
you know, I know, but that's my starting response. But
Got it. I concur.
but yet there is a threshold where, like any other kinds of field, the board has a responsibility when compensation hits a certain level to engage. But directly to your point, one thing boards can do with their presidents and maybe with their ADs is to create a framework for what's in a contract that others then negotiate. And so in this AGB statement, and I think each of our prior two, we are very clear about what the job of a coach should be. Coaches do what coaches do, but that coaches should be incentivized also for student success, student athlete success as students. And that should be measured as well. So clearly a board can stipulate the standards that would go into coaches' contracts to either how to weight certain criteria. So I agree.
Final question.
Just really appreciate all the information and the leadership that's been shown. The one area where I've tried to spend a lot of time over the years concentrating on is culture. And so no matter what your numbers say, there's always another part of the story, which is how did you get to the numbers? In other words, if you're having success with wins and losses, is it coming at the expense of the student athlete or is it coming on their behalf? Is the culture of the athletic department a healthy culture where people look forward to coming to work every day, that they feel like they're being developed as professionals, and that trickles down to the quality of the experience for the student athlete? And so that's an area where, it's the qualitative stuff that's still really important. And we have a tendency to talk about that stuff as the soft skills. And yet, at the end of the day, a lot of the controversy that we've seen in collegiate athletics has to do with the soft skills. It's the empowerment of the athlete to speak up, or for people at every level of the organization to say, what you're doing is not consistent with what the values we've espoused, so I'm going to go tell somebody and I'm not going to worry about repercussion. That we don't need to necessarily legislate that the coaches shouldn't be telling the medical staff what to do in regard to when somebody's back to playing and healthy enough to play and participate. It's those things that have more to do with values than they do with numbers. And it's that part of it that I would hope that the boards are going to continue to be vigilant about with respect to the cultures on college campuses and the experiences of the athletes.
Totally agree.
Please give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you so much for your time.
Just real briefly, we want to remind the panelists you're invited to join the commission for lunch, and for any media, there'll be a brief press conference in the Muro room. Thank you.
In my press comments, it says that we've endorsed that statement. Did we?
We are now.
Okay. So we didn't vote or anything.
No, it's
Just by virtue of having it here. Okay. I didn't think I missed anything, but.
No, it was kind of part of our, maybe I should have covered that one when we went over the press release, because it's in the press
Okay.
release. One of those
Well,
paragraphs in the press
then they've seen it, nobody objected. Okay. Okay.
The other thing is,
That's great, thanks.
we'll only have,
What they basically get right now.
Okay.